She didn't scream when the trailer caught fire. She just wrapped her arms around her youngest and waited for the end until a stranger emerged from the snow and carried her back to life. This isn't a story about a hero. It's about what happens after the rescue, when love grows, not from grand gestures, but from warmth meals shared in silence and the healing only a child's hand can offer. Before we begin, if stories of quiet miracles and second chances speak to something in you, consider subscribing. We tell the kinds of stories that stay with you long after the last word. Now let me take you to a cabin deep in the Colorado woods, where a fire didn't end. A family, it built one. The snow hadn't let up for hours. It fell like a curtain over the Colorado mountains, thick and blinding, erasing roads, homes, fences, everything but memory. Dean Holloway's hands gripped the steering wheel of his weathered pickup, knuckles white with tension. His breath fogged up the windshield faster than the defroster could clear it. Outside, pine trees swayed under the weight of winter, their branches cracking like old bones. He glanced over to the passenger seat, where a child's shoe, pink, faded, and too small for anyone who lived anymore, sat beside a folded photograph. A girl's face smiled back at him, frozen in time. Emma. He blinked hard and looked back to the road. There were no other cars. There were never any other cars out here. The silence was broken only by the low hum of the radio, until even that gave out with a pop of static. Dean reached to switch it off when he saw it a flicker of orange against the gray and white world. At first he thought it was his eyes playing tricks. But when he slowed, a sharper shape emerged, a mobile home barely visible in the distance, a flame dancing out one broken window. His heart surged. Fire. In this cold, no one could survive long, especially not in a structure like that. He slammed the gear into park, grabbed the emergency kit and blanket from the back seat, and jumped out into the howling storm. The snow was knee-deep, and it clung to every inch of him as he trudged forward. As he drew closer, the picture sharpened, smoke poured from the roof, and the front door was blocked by snowdrift and warped siding. And then he heard it. A scream. Faint. High-pitched. A child.
Dean's instincts, deadened for years, roared back to life. He dropped the blanket and shouldered through the side of the trailer, using his boot to kick out a loose window frame. Heat smacked him in the face, sharp and alive. Inside, smoke billowed in waves.
He ducked low, crawling through the wreckage of a tiny kitchen, his throat searing with every breath. "Hello!" he bellowed. Another cry, this time closer. He pushed through a half-collapsed hallway and found them 3 children huddled in a corner. 2 older kids, 1 boy and 1 girl covered in soot. The youngest, a girl maybe 5, lay in the arms of a woman unconscious, slumped over her protectively. Dean didn't hesitate. He wrapped the youngest in the emergency blanket, slung the woman's limp body over his shoulder, and barked at the 2 older children. "Come on, stay low. Follow my voice." The boy nodded, eyes wide with terror, and pulled his sister with him. The trailer groaned above them, and a crash behind them sent sparks flying across the hallway as a cabinet dropped from the ceiling. Dean barely made it out in time, stumbling into the snow with all 4. He coughed violently, lungs clawing for clean air, but didn't stop moving. The children shivered behind him. The woman's body was cold against his chest. He carried her like a soldier carrying the last of his unit. He shoved open the truck door, bundled them inside. 1, 2, 3 children. And her. Inside the truck, heat blasted from the vents. Dean pressed a hand to the woman's neck. A pulse, faint but there. He wrapped another blanket around her shoulders and turned to check the kids. The oldest boy, maybe 10, stared straight ahead. The older girl clung to her brother, teeth chattering. The little one stirred. Dean looked down just as the smallest girl opened her eyes weakly, barely, and whispered, "Thank you." Dean froze. Her voice was so soft it might have been the wind. outside the fire behind them hissed in the snow as it collapsed into silence. But inside the truck, time seemed to stretch. Dean looked at her. Really looked at her. Her cheeks were pale lips, cracked, but her eyes reminded him of Emma. That same quiet strength, that same need for someone to stay. And without thinking, he reached back and let her tiny fingers curl around his thumb. She didn't let go. He drove slowly through the falling snow, not sure where he was going, only that he could not leave them behind. His mind reeled. Who were they? What were they doing in that trailer? Why was no one else there? He didn't have the answers. But as he stole one last glance in the rearview mirror at those three fragile souls wrapped in blankets, leaning against their silent, soot-streaked mother, he felt something shift inside him. A door that had long been locked cracked open just a little. Maybe it was the fire. Maybe it was the snow. Or maybe it was the feeling that for the first time in years his heart had chosen something to burn for again. The wind had quieted by the time Dean's truck creaked its way up the narrow road to his cabin. Snow coated the pines like dusted sugar, and the tire tracks he left behind were the only evidence anyone had passed through this remote stretch of Colorado wilderness. The cabin stood at the edge of a ridge, modest, solid, and built by Dean's own hands. He'd added rooms over the years, not out of need, but to keep busy. Now, for the first time, it might actually feel lived in. Dean pulled the truck under the carport and killed the engine. A wave of silence fell around them. The two older kids were asleep, heads tilted against the backseat windows. The youngest still clutched Dean's finger, her grip limp but present. The woman, Rachel, he later learned, remained unconscious, breathing shallow but steady beneath the wool blanket he'd wrapped around her in the truck. Dean stepped out and exhaled a long breath into the frozen air. He wasn't prepared for this. Not for three kids. Not for a woman who might wake up and scream at the sight of him. But none of that mattered right now. He opened the passenger door and gently lifted Rachel into his arms. She didn't stir. "Hang tight, little ones," he murmured to the children still sleeping. "We're home." Inside, the warmth of the wood-burning stove greeted them with the scent of pine and ash. Dean laid Rachel down carefully on the couch, covering her with two quilts. He turned up the thermostat and checked her temperature, not dangerously high, but certainly not safe to ignore. He'd keep her hydrated and warm, monitor her breathing, and pray she wouldn't need a hospital. The nearest clinic was 40 miles away, and the roads were already a mess. He returned to the truck and carried each child inside one by one, placing them on a makeshift bed of cushions in the den near the stove. He grabbed old sleeping bags, extra pillows, and after a moment's hesitation, his daughter's childhood teddy bear, still sitting untouched on a shelf in the back room. He placed it beside the youngest girl. She smiled in her sleep. As dawn crept over the horizon, the cabin took on a new shape. Where there had been only silence now, there were soft breaths, little murmurs, the rustling of blankets. Dean moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing oatmeal and warming milk. He hadn't cooked for anyone but himself in years, but his hands remembered what it felt like to make food that mattered. The first to stir was the boy. He sat up with a start, eyes darting across the room, fists clenched. Dean crouched down slowly, hands open, voice low and even. "You're safe," he said. "I'm Dean. You're at my home. Your mom's inside resting. You're all okay now." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes held that feral mix of fear and protection. Dean recognized he'd seen it in the mirror years ago after Emma died. "I'm Caleb," the boy said finally. "That's Ellie. The little one's Gracie. My mom's Rachel. Nice to meet you." "Caleb," Dean said gently. "Breakfast's almost ready. The smell of warm food did the rest." Caleb nodded slowly. A moment later, Ellie stirred, blinking as she pulled the blanket to her chin. Gracie remained fast asleep, curled around the teddy bear like it was stitched from hope. By noon, the cabin felt different. Livelier. Messier. Fuller. Rachel had not yet woken, though Dean had gotten a few sips of water into her, and her color had improved. He'd cleaned the smoke from her skin with a damp cloth and laid a cool rag on her forehead. Her face was younger than he'd expected, worn not by age, but by weight, grief, exhaustion, fear. He recognized it. He had lived it. Caleb remained protective, watching Dean's every move with cautious eyes. Ellie warmed quicker. She wandered the house like it was made of clouds and stories, pausing often to stare at old photographs on the wall, especially the one of Emma. She didn't ask, but Dean saw the curiosity brewing. As for Gracie, she hadn't let go of that bear. When Dean passed by her makeshift bed, she reached for his coat, not saying a word, but leaning her head against his knee, before falling back asleep. That nearly broke him. Late afternoon brought a stillness over the house that felt new, not empty, but peaceful. Dean stood in the doorway to the living room, watching the fire crackle in the stove. The kids were all resting again. Rachel's breathing had deepened. The warmth of the place had started to soften even the deepest cracks. He thought of how quickly everything had changed. Just yesterday, the cabin had felt like a tomb, a place he maintained out of obligation to the past. Today it felt like a shelter, a threshold, a beginning. The snow had stopped falling. Dean stepped outside for a moment, taking in the silence of the mountains. He looked up at the sky, gray, stretching endlessly, and whispered something he hadn't said in years. "Thank you for not letting me keep the door closed." Rachel awoke to the scent of wood smoke and oatmeal, warm, comforting, and entirely foreign. Her eyes opened slowly, lids heavy with exhaustion. The ceiling above her was made of knotty pine. The air held the faint crackle of a fire, and a silence that didn't feel threatening, just unfamiliar. She sat up too quickly. The room spun. "Easy," there came a low voice from across the room. "You've been out for 2 days." Rachel's body froze. Dean stood in the doorway holding a chipped blue mug. His voice was calm, not pitying. His flannel shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his face unshaven but clean. Kind eyes, rough hands, everything in his posture said, "You're safe." Still, Rachel's instinct screamed, "Get the kids! Get out! Now!" "Where are they?" she rasped, throat dry and raw. Dean stepped aside. "All 3 are here. Warm. Fed. They've been sleeping. A lot like you." Rachel blinked, trying to focus. She saw quilts, soft ones stacked in the corner, a pile of boots drying by the stove. And in the next room, Caleb sleeping upright in a rocking chair, Ellie curled on a sofa with a book, and Gracie lay curled under a blanket on a thick rug, clutching a teddy bear she hadn't owned before. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She didn't have the strength to fight. Dean said nothing. He just walked over, handed her the mug, and waited. She took it with trembling hands and sipped slowly. It wasn't coffee. It was broth. Homemade. Warm. Simple. Kind. "You pulled us out?" she asked finally. Dean nodded, caught sight of the fire. Didn't think. Just drove toward it. Rachel studied him. No bravado. No hint of "you owe me." Just facts, offered with the steadiness of someone who'd stopped waiting for anything in return. "I thought we were going to die," she whispered. Dean didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered ridge. Then he said almost too quietly to hear doubted eye. Once, she knew that tone, the ache behind it. A man who had already buried something too precious to name. Later that day, she sat by the fire while Ellie braided Gracie's hair, and Caleb watched from across the room, always on alert. Dean brought bowls of stew he'd spent half the morning making. Rachel hesitated before taking a bite. "Don't worry." "No poison," Dean said, half smiling. She looked down. I haven't accepted a meal from anyone in a long time. Dean didn't press. Instead, he picked up a small piece of wood from beside the hearth and began carving into it with a pocket knife, quietly, like it was more a habit than a craft. "I know this isn't what you planned," he said. "Waking up in a stranger's house." Rachel gave a tired laugh. "I didn't plan on much of anything lately. Planning stopped the day we had to leave Kansas." Dean looked up. Rachel hesitated. Then, like air finally breaking through after years underwater, she said, "We were living in my late husband's trailer. He passed 4 years ago. Suicide. Left me with 3 kids and enough debt to sink a city. His family, well, they weren't interested in damaged goods. We moved, tried to start over. But it just never quite happened." Her voice cracked on the last word. Dean didn't interrupt. He didn't say "I'm sorry" or offer platitudes. He just nodded slow and steady. "You've been carrying a lot alone," he said simply. Rachel looked into his eyes, and for the first time didn't feel judged, just seen. That evening, while the kids played with a puzzle in the den, Rachel wandered into the kitchen. Dean was cleaning up. "You're home," she said softly. "It feels lived in, but also like no one's really lived here for a long time." Dean paused, drying his hands. "That's fair. Where's your family?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then opened a drawer, took out a framed photo and handed it to her. A girl, maybe 8. Freckles, missing front tooth, light in her eyes that could have powered the world. "Emma," he said. "My daughter." Rachel swallowed. "She looks joyful." "She was," Dean replied. "Died in a car fire 7 years ago last month." Silence fell. "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered. Dean nodded, but didn't look away from the photo. Her mother left not long after. "I've been here ever since, fixing things that didn't need fixing, building shelves for books I never read, talking to her sometimes when it's real quiet." Rachel's voice was small. "You're kind, Dean, even after all that." Dean looked at her eyes, serious but gentle. "I'm not sure if kindness survived, but reflex did. When I saw that fire, I just ran." Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she reached up and returned the frame to the drawer, not hiding it, honoring it. That night, Dean laid out extra blankets and insisted Rachel take his bed. She refused, of course. They compromised on the couch. As she tucked in, Gracie Caleb hovered near the door. "He's okay," Rachel whispered. Caleb glanced toward the hallway where Dean moved about in quiet, methodical steps. "He's not trying to hurt us," she added. "I know," Caleb said, "but I'm not used to people like that." Rachel looked down at her son, then kissed his head. "Neither am I." The sun poured gold through the kitchen window, warming the grain of the old pine table. It had sat untouched for years, pushed against the far wall, beneath a dusty window, its surface marred by water rings and tiny scratches, a remnant of a time Dean no longer allowed himself to speak of. That morning, he stood before it, rubbing it down with oil and a rag smoothing the scars, like they were memories he could finally face. Across the room, Caleb was stacking kindling near the stove, with the steady determination of someone far older than his age. Ellie and Gracie were outside making small snow people with crooked stick arms and borrowed scarves. Rachel was resting again, still weak, but getting stronger. Dean reached for the hammer and a few salvaged pieces of lumber. He could have made a new table. But that wasn't what this was about. It was about adding seats. He reinforced the legs, added an extra board to widen the top. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to hold 5 people, 4 who had stumbled into his life and 1 who'd never really left it. By dusk, the table gleamed under the hanging Edison bulb, modest but proud. Rachel came into the room holding a stack of dishes. Her movements were still slow, but there was color in her cheeks. Her eyes fell on the table, and she stopped mid-step. "You fixed it," she said quietly. Dean nodded. Figured it deserved to be useful again. Rachel ran her hand across the polished surface. "There's 5 seats." Dean looked at her, something unreadable behind his eyes. "There are 5 of you." A beat of silence passed, not uncomfortable, just full. "I don't know the last time we sat at a real table," she murmured. "Back in Kansas, it was trays, crates, the floor, never all at once." Dean didn't answer. He just gestured toward the stove. "Dinner's ready." The stew was thick and savory, served with warm biscuits and honey Rachel had found in the back pantry. Caleb insisted on helping serve. Ellie set the forks like it was a game. Gracie clung to the teddy bear and wouldn't speak, but she climbed into her chair without being told. Dean sat at the head of the table, not out of authority, but because the other side still felt too hollow. Rachel took the seat across from him. The children sat between them, forming a quiet bridge. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dean lifted his glass of water. "To first meals," he said. Rachel blinked, then lifted hers. "To second chances." They clinked glasses, and for the first time, laughter echoed off the cabin walls. Midway through the meal, Ellie pointed at the family photo hanging over the bookshelf. "Is that your little girl?" she asked. Dean's throat tightened. "Yes." "That's Emma." "She looks like she tells a lot of jokes," Ellie said brightly. Dean smiled, surprised. "She did. Knock-knock jokes, mostly. Some real bad ones." "I like bad ones," Ellie grinned. Rachel glanced at him, eyebrows raised, with something between surprise and gratitude. "You talk about her," she said softly. "I didn't." Dean answered for a long time. "But I think she would have liked this. The noise. The mess." Rachel's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table. "I think she'd like the way you kept her photo exactly where it was." Dean looked over at the frame. "It's not just for me." After dinner, as the children played in the den, Rachel stayed behind to help clean. The radio played softly in the background, an old country song humming through static. Dean washed dishes. Rachel dried. "I used to draw," she said out of nowhere. "Children's books. Freelance. Nothing major. But after David passed, I couldn't finish a single line." Dean handed her a plate. "You miss it. I miss who I was when I believed in it." Dean didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her the last bowl, wiped his hands, and reached into a drawer. He pulled out a small notepad frayed with a pencil tucked into its spiral and handed it to her. Rachel stared at it. "Even if it's just a doodle," Dean said. "That's something." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "You're not afraid to give people pieces of yourself, are you?" "I've already lost the worst piece," he replied softly. "What's left can only be rebuilt." That night, as the kids drifted off one by one, Rachel sat at the new table alone. A mug of tea steamed in her hand. On the table before her, the notepad, and a single pencil sketch of Gracie, asleep hugging the bear. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Dean passed by the doorway and paused, watching her. She didn't look up, but she spoke anyway. "Thank you. For more than just the rescue." Dean leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "I didn't rescue you," he said. "I just answered when the fire asked a question." Rachel finally turned to face him. "And what was the question?" Dean met her eyes, steady and calm. "Are you still willing to risk your heart for a stranger?" The storm had passed, but the cold remained sharp and stubborn, like a warning the mountain never stopped whispering. The days stretched longer now, and by late morning the ridge bathed in weak winter sunlight. Dean's cabin was busier than it had ever been. Gracie spent hours building a snow fort with Ellie, while Caleb took to helping Dean in the shed, where tools clinked, wood split, and the rhythm of simple work filled the air with something like peace. Rachel was stronger now, her voice firmer, her eyes less guarded. She cooked. She folded laundry. She smiled at her children. But it was her sketchbook brought to life again that made Dean pause whenever he passed the table. It was like watching someone rediscover their own name. And yet the silence still came. Late at night, when the stove burned low and the cabin creaked with the weight of old ghosts, Dean would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when they'd have to leave, wondering if he was foolish for hoping they might not. That morning they all drove into town. It had been Dean's idea. "We need more than beans and snow," he'd said half teasing, though the truth ran deeper. The kids needed air. Rachel needed to feel the world again. And maybe Dean needed someone to see what this was, even if just for a few minutes. Town was 40 minutes down the ridge, modest quiet, a row of shingled rooftops, and one blinking gas station. They stopped at the general store first. Caleb rushed to the tools. Ellie darted to the books. Gracie, silent but bright-eyed, held tightly to Rachel's hand. Dean stayed behind to fill up the truck. He didn't notice the man until he heard his name. Holloway Dean turned. It was Roger, an old neighbor from down near Coal Bend, retired mechanic. Talked too much. Judged even more. "Thought you moved off for good," Roger said, squinting. "Living like a hermit, right? Heard about what happened to your girl? Damn shame." Dean's jaw clenched. "Something you need." Roger tilted his chin toward the store. "You with that woman? The one with all them kids?" Dean said nothing. Roger let out a low whistle. "Some folks got no sense. Just moving around? No, man. Nothing stable. And you, what are you doing, taking in someone like that?" Dean's voice was quiet. "Taking care of people isn't weakness," Roger scoffed. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you when it falls apart." Dean stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "If you've got a problem with her, you've got a problem with me." "You clear?" Roger blinked, then backed off. Inside the store, Rachel had heard everything. She stood frozen by the canned goods aisle, Gracie tugging gently at her coat. Her cheeks flushed, not from cold. When Dean walked in, she didn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "We shouldn't have come." Dean stopped. "Why, you hurt him." "I did. And I don't care." Rachel looked up at him then. There was something raw in her expression, not anger, not pride, but a weary disbelief. People like him see us coming and already decide who we are. "Then let them." Rachel's voice was small. "But what if they're right?" Dean stepped closer. "Are you?" Rachel swallowed. "I don't know." Dean looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a calm so steady it silenced the room, "You're the kind of person who shielded her child from fire with her own body. That's who you are. No one gets to rewrite that." Rachel turned away, wiping her cheek quickly. "Why do you keep saying the right thing?" Dean let out a small laugh. "Because I've said too many wrong ones in my life." They returned home quietly. The truck hummed down the ridge road, and Gracie fell asleep against Rachel's shoulder. Ellie held a paperback in her lap, flipping pages, but not really reading. As they pulled into the drive, Dean noticed something new: laughter. The kids burst out of the truck and ran toward the snow fort like the day had never bent. Rachel stayed behind, staring out the windshield. Dean waited. "Back there," she said, finally. "I felt exposed, like I didn't belong." Dean nodded slowly. "That feeling doesn't mean it's true." Rachel turned to him. "When was the last time you felt like you belonged?" Dean didn't speak for a long moment. "Then, before Emma died, I used to build things for people. Benches, bookshelves, signs for local shops. People would stop by, ask for help, sit on my porch. I used to think maybe that was enough. And after I forgot how to dream," Dean said. didn't see the point in making space for anyone who might leave. Rachel reached across the console and laid her hand on his. "You did make space," she whispered. "You just didn't realize it yet." That night, after the kids went to sleep, Rachel stayed back in the kitchen, sketchbook in hand. Dean sat across the room, carving something into the edge of the rebuilt table. After a while, Rachel walked over. "What are you doing?" she asked. Dean turned the table slightly to show her the underside where 5 names had been carved. 4 in block letters: Caleb, Ellie, Gracie, Rachel, and 1 in smaller curved script: Emma. Rachel pressed her fingers gently to the wood. Then she looked at him, and something inside her softened in the quiet. Dean didn't speak. He didn't need to, because sometimes, when 2 people have known enough silence, they recognize each other best in the absence of words. Snow had begun to melt slowly and stubbornly, turning the cabin's dirt path into a patchwork of mud and thaw. The mornings were still cold, but the light came earlier, now peeking through the bare trees like a promise not yet spoken. Rachel stood at the window, with her tea, watching Ellie and Gracie play with a stick and a tattered red sled that Dean had pulled from storage. Caleb, ever serious, was helping Dean split kindling. The sharp, measured crack of axe on wood echoed through the stillness, like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. Inside the cabin was warm, but Rachel's hands were cold. She turned to the small canvas bag she hadn't touched since the fire. It sat on the chair in the corner of Dean's room, now hers, though she refused to call it that. She hadn't opened it since they arrived. Maybe she was afraid of what had survived. She unzipped it. Now fingers hesitant. Inside, under worn clothes and a broken zipper pouch of cough drops, was a yellowed envelope, creased soft and unsent. Her name was written in her own hand, but the name on the front said, David, her late husband. Rachel sat down, the envelope held lightly between her fingertips like it might turn to ash. She remembered writing it a week before his death, a night when the weight of their unraveling had pressed too hard on her chest. She had never mailed it, never read it aloud, never even told anyone it existed. Until now. Dean was sanding a wooden frame on the front porch when she appeared in the doorway. "I need a quiet place," she said. "And maybe someone who's not afraid of quiet." Dean nodded without question. Back porch. The bench under the pines. It doesn't judge. She almost smiled. 10 minutes later, she sat beside him, a blanket over her knees, the letter in her hands. Dean had brought tea. He didn't ask what was in the envelope, just waited, patient and still. Rachel stared straight ahead, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wrote this before David died. I never sent it, never showed it to anyone. I don't even know if I still believe the words inside. But I think maybe someone should hear them. Just once." Dean didn't speak. He simply nodded, and she began. "Dear David, I know you think I'm angry all the time, and maybe I am. But I'm not angry that we're broke, or that I'm tired, or that the house leaks in 5 places. I'm angry that I don't recognize the man sitting across from me anymore, the one who used to laugh at breakfast or carry Gracie upside down just to make her giggle. I'm angry that you've disappeared from your own life, and I can't find the words to call you back. But underneath the anger, there's grief, there's fear, there's love. I don't know what to do with anymore. I still believe you are good, that the man I married is still in there somewhere, and I still hope God. I hope you'll let me in again before the silence becomes a wall neither of us can scale. Love, Rachel." The letter trembled in her hands. Dean remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the edge of the forest blurred into cloud. After he died, Rachel said, her voice shaking, "I blamed myself for not saying that out loud, for not fighting harder, for not being enough to bring him back. Dean finally turned to her. "You were enough," he said quietly. "You were just alone." She looked at him, startled by the simplicity of the truth. "Do you want to keep the letter?" he asked. Rachel stared at it, then shook her head. "I think I want to let it go." Dean stood, walked over to the fire pit, and crouched beside it. She followed. Together they watched as the flames caught the paper. It curled, turned black, then disappeared. No dramatic wind. No epiphany. Just release. That evening, Dean found her in the den with Gracie, asleep in her lap, and Ellie tucked against her side. The sketchbook lay open beside them, a half-finished drawing of the cabin, with 5 windows glowing from within. Rachel looked up. "Do you ever feel like something's waiting for you to believe in it again?" Dean raised an eyebrow. "Like faith?" "No," she said. "Like life. Like it's standing just outside your door, with its hand out, but you're too scared to open up again." Dean knelt by the fireplace, adding a log, watching the embers shift. "I used to believe that if I opened the door, the wind would take what little I had left," he said. "But lately, I'm starting to think maybe someone's out there who knows how to close it behind them. Gently. Carefully. So the heat stays in." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't have to, because Gracie stirred, then murmuring in her sleep, and reached blindly, instinctively for Dean's hand. He took it without hesitation, and in that quiet moment, nothing spectacular happened. But something unspoken settled into place. The attic above Dean's cabin had been locked for years, not with a key, but with memory. No one was forbidden from going up there. It was simply left alone. A space Dean used to fill with spare lumber boxes of Nail's winter tools. But over time, it became more than a storage space. It became a museum of what he couldn't part with, a place where time stood still beneath a slanted roof and dust-thick air. And it was Gracie silent. Gracie who wandered up there first. It was early afternoon when Dean noticed her absence. He checked the front porch, the kitchen behind the stove where she liked to curl up with the teddy bear. Then he heard it. A soft creak from above. He opened the attic hatch and pulled down the ladder. Gracie's small feet dangled above the top rung, frozen in surprise. She clutched something in her arms. Dean climbed up, heart caught between panic and something else. At the top, dust floated in golden shafts of light. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls. An old trunk sat open. Inside a music box, children's books, a hand-knit scarf, a folded pair of tiny jeans. And next to it, a carved wooden box. Dark walnut. Worn edges. A name etched on top, Emma. Dean stopped cold. Gracie looked up at him, eyes wide, then held out the box with both hands. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. Her voice, so rare, so deliberate, hit him harder than any fire ever could. Dean knelt down, slowly took the box from her. "It's okay," he said. Voice hushed. "You didn't break anything." She hesitated, then asked, "Was she yours?" Dean nodded. "My daughter." Gracie stepped closer. "Can I see?" Dean sat back against the attic wall, opened the box. Inside, a bundle of old letters tied with ribbon, a charm bracelet with a single star, a crayon drawing of a man with big boots and a girl with messy hair labeled Daddy and Me. And at the very bottom, folded carefully, a half-finished sheet of music. Gracie touched it reverently. "Is it a song?" Dean swallowed hard. "One I never finished." That night, Rachel found them both at the dining table. Gracie sat beside Dean, humming softly, while he held the sheet of music with fingers that trembled less than they used to. Rachel approached quietly. She found the attic. Dean nodded, eyes still on the page. Rachel noticed something else. He'd written new notes beneath the old ones. "Are you finishing it?" she asked gently. Dean looked up. "Trying." Rachel took a seat across from him, the lamp casting long shadows across the table. What's it called? Dean hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, the fire that chose us. Rachel didn't speak. Her hand reached across the table and rested lightly over his. No one moved. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin something had shifted, a thread of music winding its way through grief and memory, threading them together, stitch by slow, forgiving stitch. The next morning, Ellie pulled Rachel aside. "She hasn't slept in your bed for 2 nights," she said. Rachel blinked. "Who, Gracie?" "She curls up outside Dean's door. Says she likes the way he listens even when she's not talking." Rachel didn't know how to respond. She looked out the window toward the woodshed, where Dean and Caleb were hauling firewood. "She trusts him," Ellie added. "Like Dad. But different. Different, how Rachel asked. Ellie thought for a moment. Dad used to disappear when things got hard. Dean just stays. That afternoon, as Dean cleaned out the fireplace, he found Gracie standing behind him, holding something wrapped in fabric. She offered it shyly. He unwrapped it to reveal a small wooden star, clearly carved with uneven hands. On one side, a shaky set of initials, E.H. Emma Holloway. Gracie whispered, "I wanted her to have a piece of today." Dean's chest tightened. He looked at the child before him, barely 6, barely healed, and saw in her something achingly familiar, the capacity to love without certainty, to give without guarantee. He placed the star on the mantel beside Emma's photo. "I think she'd like that," he said. Gracie smiled, a real one this time. Then did something Dean would remember for the rest of his life. She leaned in, pressed her forehead gently against his chest, and whispered, "You don't have to be alone anymore." Dean closed his eyes and breathed. That night, when Rachel came to check on Gracie, she found her curled up in the rocking chair near the fireplace, the teddy bear in one hand, Dean's music sheet tucked under the other. The firelight flickered across the words written at the top in Dean's handwriting, "To the ones who found me again." Rachel knelt, smoothed Gracie's hair, and whispered into the warmth. "We all did, baby. We all found something." And from the corner of the room, Dean watched them both, one hand over his heart, the other holding a finished melody. The smell of cinnamon filled the cabin. Rachel stood by the stove stirring batter for pancakes, while Gracie hummed nearby, crouched over a pile of colored pencils. Outside the window, snow melted in thin rivulets from the porch railing, leaving the scent of pine and damp earth in the air. For the first time in weeks, there was laughter in the kitchen. Light. Almost ordinary. Dean had gone to town with Caleb for supplies, giving Rachel and the girls time to settle into the morning at their own pace. The kettle began to whistle. Rachel moved to lift it, but her hand brushed the cast-iron skillet instead, hot scalding. The pan clattered to the floor, tipping oil onto the burner. A small flame jumped up with a hiss, barely higher than a candle. But to Rachel, it might as well have been a wildfire. Her breath caught, her chest squeezed, her eyes locked on the flame and refused to blink. She froze. Gracie stood first. "Mom," she whispered, unsure. Rachel didn't answer. Her fingers gripped the counter, her eyes blurred not with smoke, but memory. Flames licking across walls, a child's cough, the weight of her body shielding Gracie's. Her knees buckled. She hit the floor hard. Gracie screamed. When Dean returned 20 minutes later, the front door was ajar, and Gracie was sitting on the steps outside, hugging her knees, face pale. His heart dropped. He rushed inside. The kitchen was quiet. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, along with something else. Fear. He found Rachel in the bedroom, sitting on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wall, knees to her chest, eyes red, distant. He didn't speak. He sat down beside her. Minutes passed in silence. "I couldn't move," she said finally. It wasn't even a real fire, just oil. I could have covered it in 2 seconds. But my body, it went somewhere else. Dean nodded slowly. Sometimes the body remembers before the mind does. Rachel laughed bitterly. That's comforting. It should be, he said gently. It means you're still healing. Not broken. She looked at him then. Really looked. I keep thinking if I pretend I'm okay long enough, it'll be true. Dean leaned back against the wall, their shoulders just inches apart. I used to think that too. After Emma. I'd tell myself I was managing, that I was getting by. But I wasn't living. I was surviving. And surviving isn't the same thing as staying. Rachel wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Then why did you stay? Dean turned to her. Because I thought if I left that house, that road, that pain, I'd lose what little I had left of her. Rachel closed her eyes, the words hitting too close. But now Dean continued, voice low. And even, I think maybe she's been waiting for me to add something. Not replace her. Just add. Rachel let out a long, shaky breath. That fire didn't kill us. But I've been living like it did. Dean reached out then, not forceful, not urgent, just a hand between them open. Rachel took it. And for the first time since the trailer burned, she let someone steady her. Later that evening, Dean stood at the porch, railing, watching twilight settle like a blanket over the forest. The sky was brushed with lavender and gold. The birds had begun to return, timid, but hopeful. Rachel stepped outside beside him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. I'm sorry about this morning, she said softly. You don't need to be. I do, because something happened today that's more terrifying than that flame. Dean turned to her. I realized she whispered that I don't want to run anymore. A pause. I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this cabin, this place it feels more like home than anywhere we've ever been. Dean looked at her quiet for a long beat. Then, with something between a smile and a vow, he said, Then let's build it. One day at a time. That night, as the children slept and the fire crackled low, Rachel wandered into the kitchen alone. She approached the stove slowly. This time, she turned it on with intention. Watched the flame rise blue and quiet, and held her hand a safe distance above the heat. Her heart pounded, but she didn't look away. She boiled water. She made tea. She carried 2 mugs to the table. When Dean joined her moments later, she slid a cup toward him and said, The fire isn't always the end. He raised his cup. No, he agreed. Sometimes it's the beginning. The cabin smelled of pine shavings and fresh paint. It was Sunday afternoon, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft squares of gold across the floorboards. Ellie and Caleb were outside hammering scrap wood into what they claimed would be the world's greatest treehouse. Gracie napped in her mother's arms, breath slow and warm. Rachel had moved her sketching things to the dining table. It was no longer just a table. It had become a heart beating quietly at the center of this fragile new life. And on it sat her newest piece, a large canvas nearly complete. The cabin stood in the painting, modest, strong, familiar. A thin trail of chimney smoke curled into the sky. Trees towered behind it, and snow covered the ground, melting in gentle patches that suggested spring was near. 4 figures stood in the yard. Caleb with a hammer in hand, Ellie with wind-tousled hair, and a book, Gracie holding her teddy bear. But the 5th figure standing at the cabin steps was only sketched, his body outlined, his stance sure. But his face was left empty. Rachel stared at it, brush motionless in her hand. She heard Dean before she saw him, his boots tapping lightly on the hardwood floor, his presence quiet but unmistakable. He stood at her side and looked down at the painting. You captured them, he said softly. They look like they belong. Rachel nodded. Dean leaned a little closer. And that's me, it is, she said. He paused. You didn't finish the face. No. Not sure how to. Rachel set the brush down, then folded her hands in her lap. I think, she said slowly, it's because I'm not painting you from memory. I'm painting you from trust. And that's something still forming. Dean let those words settle. There was no accusation in them. No fear. Just honesty, raw and real. He sat down across from her. When I lost Emma, he said I told myself no one else would ever occupy that part of my heart. I thought it was safer honoring her by protecting the empty space she left behind. Rachel listened, eyes fixed on him. But now he continued. I don't think she'd want that. I think she'd want me to use that space, not to replace her, but to carry more love. Rachel's fingers tightened around her mug. I know that feeling. Dean glanced at the unfinished face. What would it take for you to paint me fully? Rachel didn't answer at first. Then barely above a whisper, to believe that if I did, you wouldn't disappear. That evening, the first thunderstorm of the season rolled across the ridge. The children huddled together under blankets, while rain tapped against the windows like a memory trying to get in. Dean lit candles. Rachel pulled out a deck of cards. They played until the power flickered, once then went out completely. The cabin didn't fall into fear. It fell into laughter. Gracie squealed when Ellie tried to cheat. Caleb pretended to win every hand. And Dean, watching them, saw something break loose in Rachel, a tension she'd been holding at the base of her neck, finally melt away. She was laughing, head back, unguarded. And for that moment, she wasn't a widow, or a survivor, or a guest. She was home. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Rachel walked out to the porch. The rain had slowed to a whisper. Lightning flickered far in the distance, painting silver streaks behind the trees. Dean joined her, 2 mugs of tea in hand. He offered one without a word. She took it, then looked up at him. Do you ever wonder, she said, what it would have been like if we'd met before all the breaking happened? Dean smiled, slow and sad. I used to think about that kind of thing. What ifs? Maybes. Now, I think we met exactly when we needed to. Rachel sipped her tea. Do you ever want to run? She asked. Sometimes, especially when it gets too quiet. That's when I hear the past the loudest. And now, Dean looked out into the darkness. Now, the quiet feels like an invitation. Rachel turned toward him. To what? He met her eyes, steady and soft. To stay. The next morning, the painting was different. Rachel stood at the table, brush in hand. The morning light danced across the canvas. The 5th figure was still there, same stance, same outline. But now his face bore gentle eyes, a half smile, and a hint of weariness carved by love. Dean walked into the room, still groggy, rubbing the back of his neck. He stopped when he saw it. You finished me, he said. Rachel set the brush down, wiped her hands on a cloth. No, she said, smiling faintly. I just stopped being afraid. Spring came quietly to the ridge. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or wildflowers, but in subtler ways, the soft drip of melted snow from the eaves, the return of birdsong at dawn, and the way the earth, once brittle and frozen, began to yield again beneath boot soles and bare feet. Inside the cabin, life shifted with the season. Rachel began waking early without the weight in her chest. Caleb stopped checking the locks at night. Ellie read her books aloud now, even when no one asked. And Gracie, though still mostly silent, had started drawing pictures and leaving them in odd places, under pillows, tucked into coat pockets, on Dean's workbench. They were pictures of 5 people. Always 5. One Saturday, Dean hauled out the old cedar planks from the shed and began building something new. It had been on his mind for weeks, a table that wasn't patched together from the past, but crafted for the present. Caleb helped him sand and smooth every surface. Ellie chose the finish. Rachel stitched cushions for the chairs, and Gracie watched it all from her corner spot by the hearth sketchbook on her knees, observing with wide, thoughtful eyes. By late afternoon, the table stood proud in the center of the cabin just beneath the overhead light, longer than the old one. Wider. 6 seats. Dean ran a hand across the surface, then stepped back. Guess we should break it in. They prepared a simple meal. Chicken and potatoes, fresh bread, Rachel's apple crumble. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon curled into the beams overhead, mingling with warmth, with wood, with a kind of hope no one wanted to say out loud. Dean placed 5 wooden nameplates at each seat. 1 for Caleb, 1 for Ellie, 1 for Gracie, 1 for Rachel. The 5th bore the name Emma. Rachel paused when she saw it. You left 1 for her. Dean nodded. She was always going to be part of this. Then he reached behind him and brought out a 6th plate, hand-carved the letters, slightly uneven, but full of care. Hope. He placed it gently before the empty seat at the far end. For whoever else the fire brings, he said. They sat down together for the first time as something more than guests, or hosts, as a family not by blood, but by choice. Halfway through the meal, Ellie leaned back in her chair, eyes full of mischief. I vote we make a tradition out of this, she declared. Every Saturday. Family dinner. Caleb snorted. Only if you're not the one cooking. I boiled water once, Ellie protested. And ruined it, he said. Laughter circled the table like a thread sewing them into something whole. Dean looked around the table chest, tight in the best way. Then his eyes fell on Gracie. She was sitting quietly, fork in hand, her drawing resting beside her plate. It was the table, this table, and the 5 of them sitting around it. Only this time, Emma's seat wasn't empty. It held a small star drawn with gold crayon. Dean swallowed hard. Rachel followed his gaze, then looked at Gracie. Sweetheart, she whispered, that's beautiful. Gracie nodded slowly, then set her fork down. Silence fell. She took a breath. And then clear and small, but certain, she spoke. We're not missing anyone anymore. Dean's hand stopped midair. Rachel's eyes filled instantly. Ellie gasped. Caleb whispered. She talked. Gracie looked directly at Dean. You gave us a home. Dean couldn't speak. He didn't try. Instead, he stood and walked to her side. He knelt down eye to eye. Gracie reached for something behind her chair and held it out, a small stone, painted with 5 figures under a tree. You can put this outside, she said, so the world knows. Dean took the stone with shaking hands. I think he said hoarsely, it already does. That night, after the dishes were cleaned and the kids tucked into their beds, Rachel found Dean on the porch. He was staring at the stars. She stepped beside him, wrapped in a shawl. I keep waiting for it to break, she whispered. Dean turned to her. For what to break? This whatever we've built. I keep thinking it's too good, that it's borrowed, that it can't last. Dean took a long breath, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded slip of paper, the music sheet. I finished it, he said. Rachel raised her brows. All of it. He nodded. Every note. Then he turned it over and handed it to her. On the back in his handwriting were 5 words, built not from fear. Love. Rachel traced the words with her fingers. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, she whispered. Dean looked at her, gentle and steady. You're not just safe, he said. You're home. Summer arrived on the ridge like a long exhale. The snow had vanished weeks ago. In its place came wild grasses, the sweet scent of pine needles warming in the sun, and the gentle murmur of wind through open windows. The cabin, once a silent relic of what had been lost, now sang quietly each morning with the clinking of cereal bowls, the tapping of crayons on wood, the sound of laughter echoing between rafters. Dean stood by the kitchen window rolling up his sleeves. He had just finished installing a new swing beneath the tallest tree out front. Gracie's giggles still lingered in his ears. They were the kind of sounds that stuck to your ribs that became part of your bones. Behind him, Rachel packed a picnic basket. They were headed to the town's Founders' Day Fair, a modest event, but one the children had been talking about for weeks. Ellie had signed up for the storytelling contest. Caleb wanted to enter the pie-eating competition. And Gracie, well, she just wanted to bring her painted rock, the one that said, "We found home." Rachel moved around the cabin with ease now. She fit not like a guest, but like someone who had always been meant to be there. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid, her hands steady as she sliced apples. "You nervous?" she asked without looking up. Dean glanced at her, surprised. "About what?" "Going into town, with all of us, together." Dean considered it. There was a time not long ago when the thought of eyes on him on them would have felt like walking into a fire with no exit. But now... "No," he said. "Finally. I think I'm ready to be seen." Rachel smiled. "So am I." The fair was already underway when they arrived. Colorful tents lined the main square. Children ran through bubbles blown from a giant wand. Folk music played from a makeshift stage near the courthouse steps. Dean parked the truck under a sycamore. As they stepped out, he felt the weight of something unfamiliar on his shoulders. It took him a moment to realize it was pride. Not pride in himself, but in them. People noticed. Of course they did. The town hadn't forgotten the quiet carpenter who disappeared after his daughter's funeral, but they hadn't expected to see him again. Not like this. He walked beside Rachel, a child on each side, and didn't flinch when someone stopped and said, "Dean Holloway." It was Mrs. Redden, the school librarian, 65, brisk and kind. She eyed the children, then Rachel, then Dean. But there was no judgment in her expression, just curiosity. Dean smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly. "They look good on you." Dean met her gaze and said something he hadn't said in a long, long time. "They are good for me." Later that afternoon, the family gathered under the tent, marked Community Showcase. Paintings and wood carvings lined the walls. A small crowd gathered around a centerpiece canvas, a cabin nestled in forest snow, melting on the roof. 5 figures standing outside it, one holding a star. Rachel stood silently beside the painting. Her signature was small, tucked in the bottom corner. A young woman nearby whispered, "That's the one everyone keeps talking about." Another added, "It feels like forgiveness." Rachel smiled but didn't say a word. Dean stepped behind her, placing a steady hand on her back. "I knew it would speak," he murmured. Rachel turned to him. "It's your song." Dean shook his head. "It's our story." That evening, just as the fair began to wind down, the mayor approached the stage with a microphone. "We have one more surprise tonight," he said, "before we all head home." He gestured to the far end of the tent, where a small group of musicians began tuning their instruments. One of our own Dean Holloway has finished a piece of music he began years ago, and tonight, for the first time, he's chosen to let the town hear it. The crowd turned, surprised. Dean stood frozen. He hadn't planned on this, but Gracie's hand found his. "You told me to be brave," she whispered. "I'll be brave if you are." Dean's chest rose. Then slowly he walked to the front of the tent, picked up the guitar he hadn't touched in public since Emma died, took a breath, and played. It wasn't perfect. His fingers trembled once or twice, but the melody, soft, honest, full of ache and healing, washed over the crowd like the wind that comes after a long fire. No words, just music. At the final chord, the silence was absolute. Then applause. Gentle at first, then rising. Dean looked out and saw them, Rachel clapping with tears in her eyes, Caleb standing tall, Ellie beaming, and Gracie had her arms wrapped around Emma's stone. That night, back at the cabin, Rachel tucked the children in, while Dean stepped outside alone. The stars were brighter than usual. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked up. "I did it," he whispered. "I let them in." A breeze stirred the pine trees. No voice answered, but something in his chest lifted. Behind him, the cabin glowed with amber light. Laughter bubbled from the back room. Rachel appeared in the doorway, barefoot, silhouetted by the warmth behind her. Dean turned, and for the first time in a very long time, he knew he hadn't been chosen by fire. He had chosen to walk through it, so something better could rise from it. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always a joy seeing how far kindness can travel. And if stories of love, quiet courage, and second chances are something you hold close, feel free to subscribe. We share more, just like this, all told with heart. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. Your presence here means more than you know. Until next time, take care of yourself and of each other.